You are listening to Sirva Soundbites, the official podcast of Sirva, a leading global relocation management and moving services company. Let's get started.
Hi, welcome to Sirva Soundbites, where we aim to connect, inform, educate, and entertain our listeners. I'm Kate Rothwell, and I'm a Director of Account Management at Sirva. Women are shattering glass ceilings and redefining what it means to be a leader. They bring to the table diverse perspectives, innovative approaches, and collaboration, driving positive change in organizations and communities worldwide. At Sirva, we want to inspire our listeners. And so for this episode, we have invited Liz Fendt, who is the Group Chief Sales and Marketing Officer and Managing Director at TÜV SÜD, to share more about her personal career trajectory and life experiences. Would you like to introduce yourself for our listeners, please?
I will. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you, Kate, and to have this opportunity to spend some time sharing some thoughts I have with the listeners. So my name is Liz Fendt, and as you correctly pointed out, I am responsible for sales and marketing and e-commerce at TÜV SÜD. It's a very large organization in the testing, inspection, and certification industry. I'm part German. My father's German. I'm part British. My mother's British. And my claim to fame is I have almost been to 100 countries globally and lived in quite a number of them as well.
Almost. Thanks, Liz. So I know that you've got some great experiences to share, and I'm absolutely positive that our listeners are going to be really inspired too after listening to our podcast. So let's dive right in. For starters, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your early years growing up, the influences that you had in your life.
Thank you. So I think I had a different childhood to perhaps many others. I grew up in the 1970s in the UK, and my mother had quite a leading position at British Telecom and was responsible for a large team, and a large proportion of that team were male. So I do recall growing up listening to my mother talking about her leadership responsibilities and also the challenges she faced. And she instilled, I think, from the very moment I could really think and talk and listen to my mum, a mantra which is know your value. And I think that that is something that's carried me through, and her voice through the rest of my professional life and also my personal life. Um, then my parents split up when I was 11, and I then moved in with my dad because my mother was extremely busy at work. So I had a huge male influence on me between the ages of 11 and 18. And I think that was very interesting as well. I mean, I think I had this strong female mentor in my mother and a role model, of course. And my father, somebody who took a very caring view of raising me. And also, I had things that I was exposed to that perhaps a lot of other women weren't. For example, we talked a lot about politics. He taught me how to play football. He took me on a lot of adventure holidays. And I think that's also stood me in good stead. So for me, if I'm in a male environment, I don't feel uncomfortable. In many ways, it feels very comfortable to me as well. So I feel I can operate very well in both female and male groups, and also talk the talk. I can't claim that I'm particularly interested in football, but I can say that I'm very, very interested in all of the other things that he taught me: geography, politics, and to this day, I can camp anywhere wild because that's something he taught me. Every summer we went walking, extensive walking. We're not talking 1.5 hours, we're talking every day, 6 weeks, 8 hours a day. So he taught me a lot about resilience. He was extremely fit, and also taught me the value of being in the present moment, which is something that I also hugely value in what he's taught me.
Wow, that's really incredible, and I think really different to many of the experiences that some of the people growing up in the 70s had, as I did. And having such strong ties with a woman leader in your life, as well as your father, have clearly had a great impact on how your life developed. I think our listeners might be keen to hear one of the stories that you shared with me as we were preparing for this podcast, one of taking great career leaps of faith whilst also taking care of newborn babies.
Yes, it's a story I like to tell because I think it demonstrates a few things. So I'll explain the story first. So I was literally just off my maternity leave. I was living in Singapore at the time. Maternity leave is relatively short in Singapore, which in many ways I'm very grateful for because it enabled me to continue with my career. And then I was at a watershed moment. I had an offer to go from responsibility of Asia Pacific marketing to take it to a global level, which was huge. You know, you had a one-time opportunity in this organization to take responsibility for all of the marketing organization globally. My daughter was all of 6 weeks old. My second daughter, my first daughter was 2 years old. So two very, very young children. And it was a moment where I thought, what do I do? I mean, there are two options, right? One is you decide for it, one is you decide against it. And I'm sure there would have been other opportunities, but I felt it was the one that I've been really waiting for such a long time. And it was a golden opportunity. So I jumped in and I made it work. Making it work looked like this. There was an invite to a meeting in Istanbul. I traveled to Istanbul. I was still breastfeeding my second daughter, and I was in the plane and pumping the milk, having to throw it away. You can't do anything with milk in a plane anyway. I was in Istanbul for 3 days. And also had to do the same thing every 3 hours. Went to go to the hotel, pump the milk, threw it away, and then effectively had also pre-pumped the milk before I went to Istanbul in order to have sufficient milk supplies for my little daughter not to have to take formula in the meantime. And I think that that's a story of, A, deciding which path you want to take, and B, it's not going to be easy. That was not easy. And I think a lot of things that ensued weren't that easy. But what I decided to do was play a long-term game, or at least a mid-term game, to say, if I'm going to take this role, it enables me to continue in my career rather than taking a step away from it or a pause, which in my view was perhaps not the right thing to have done. I'm not saying it's not the right thing for everybody, but for me at that point in time, I felt it would stand me in good stead and it would have long-term benefits. So I did continue. I hopefully made a decent success of the global marketing gig, and then went to take on further portfolios later.
Wow, I'm sure that story is really going to resonate with plenty of the mothers who are listening to our podcast. Thank you for sharing it. I think it's really important to build a support network that helps us manage all aspects of our working and personal life. What were some of the things that helped you in that transition of getting back to work whilst also looking after two children?
I always say huge shout out to my team. There were moments where everybody who has young children experiences this. I came to work with such sleep deficit in some cases. I mean, I've really found it a struggle to even get my sentences together at the early stages. And there were two team members in particular who were just there for me. I mean, that's what a team is about, right? We're not always going to perform to 100%. There are going to be moments where even the boss, in my particular case, isn't going to be able to function as well as I normally did and do. And they held me, they carried me through those moments, those days, and they've stayed with me, and I've stayed with them for now 18 years. And I hopefully have supported them as they did me back then. I think that's one thing to say. I think another thing is you've got to fix your infrastructure. I mean, infrastructure I just talked to at the topic of work, and home infrastructure is also equally as important. And I think for me, through working full time in Singapore, it enabled me to pay for full time support, which was also of course, it was costly, but it enabled me to continue to go back to work and become a role model for my daughters. Again, playing a bit of a mid to long term game, thinking, who do I want to show up as for my two daughters? So at home, I arranged things such that there was somebody in full-time care of my children, so that I wasn't carrying that burden of mother guilt, which still was there, not is there now, but was there at the time. But I felt that it was, good for me to know that they were well looked after. I knew they were in good hands, they were in good care, and that I was doing the best thing that I could do to support them financially and also emotionally, and also to show to them that these things are possible. I wanted to be such, like my mother was, a role model to my two children.
So clearly, having a work persona is really important. But what about outside of work? Growing up in the 70s, there was this idea of having it all, both financially, being a career person as well as having a family. And a lot of times people felt that they couldn't be a leader as well as a parent and do both of those things well. How do you balance the outside life with work, being able to be a whole human being, if you like, being a mother as well as a leader?
This is something I hugely advocate for, in the sense that I feel that we can be the best version of ourselves as a professional and the best version of ourselves as a mother if we have our own identity as well. You know, I have my work persona Liz, I have my mother persona Liz, and I also am Liz the photographer, at least the amateur photographer. I'm definitely Liz the dancer. I have friendships that I have built and maintained throughout the entire of my life, who I, you know, these are women, but also men who I absolutely treasure as people who are very important to me. I take care of them, they take care of me as well, and they provide me with perspective. I think it's all about getting sufficient distance from certain things in order for you to show up as the best version of yourself at that point in time. So what I mean by that is, for example, now I'm going at work through a very large transition with the organization, and it's quite a heavy responsibility I'm carrying through this transition period. And thankfully, I have my friends. I have hobbies at the weekend and during the week. So, for example, last night I left the office, I went home, had dinner with my family, and then I went to dance for 2 hours. I genuinely do absolutely derive huge amounts of joy from dance. And it's something I advocate for is, if you haven't found it yet, whoever's listening to this podcast, try and find what truly makes you deeply happy outside of your family, outside of the mother role, and outside of your job. I think it makes you ultimately a better professional and a better mother to have your own identity and to do more of the things that you genuinely love. I mean, the more I do my dance, my photography, I love reading. I wake up every morning at 5 a.m., every morning at 5 a.m. without fail, and read for the first half an hour of my day, because it enables me to have this sort of sense of escapism. I love reading. I love the stories I read. I feel I learn a lot, and it gives me an avenue of peace and quiet and calmness before I start my day.
That's incredible. I think it's so important for people who are juggling multiple different roles to keep a healthy body and a healthy mind and having that outside perspective. I think you rightly say that um, that can help with being focused in your work life as well. Maybe one of the other areas that we can touch on, Liz, is the topic of imposter syndrome. And this is something that potentially affects women to a greater extent. And it's the tendency to believe that they are incapable or not good enough to do the things that they want to do. Um, and that means that they put up barriers and prevent themselves from doing those things and achieving what they want to do. What would be your thoughts on that?
I think that you probably won't find anybody or many people who will be as honest about it as I am, in the sense that I felt definitely a sense of imposter syndrome before it had a label attached to it. I remember distinctly, 20 years ago, my first management meeting presentation, standing up on the stage, honestly thinking, where's the door? I'm just going to run, because clearly, I don't belong here. I don't know if I have, the ability to translate what I want to say, and if that's even valued, and whether the audience will value what I have to say to them. I think I overthought it, which I definitely feel when I speak to male and female colleagues, is something that primarily women tend to face. A sense of overthinking it then becomes anxiety, which then becomes self-doubt. And I feel all of that is very corrosive. I definitely sit down quietly at least a week before anything major to think about what I genuinely have to say. And I always calm myself to say, I'm the best person because I'm the knowledgeable person of this specific subject matter. There's nobody in this room that knows this subject as well as I do. And therefore, I definitely have a role and a place, and I have something to say. And I think there's other things that I've experienced which does unnerve you, right? I mean, I think if you're more junior in your role, I've had situations where people have interrupted me, not listened to me, not valued what I've said, not echoed or responded to it. And these days I behave very differently myself. I had an amazing coach who taught me a concept of giving a pregnant pause. I think it's something I used to do 10 years ago, 20 years ago, was talk too fast And with talking too fast, it's ultimately difficult to actually understand what that person's saying. And in doing that, you're not really having that sense of gravitas or importance or significance. So in the meantime, I say a lot less, A, and B, I put pauses between the important things I have to say. And I also have enough confidence to contain or build and retain eye contact with the people I'm talking to. And I think, for example, you've got to find what enables you to keep your presence and your calmness. And everybody has their own individual style. And, I realized that for me, cracking the fear of public speaking was really about building conversations with the audience rather than thinking it's, me against them or them against me. And in doing that, I started conversing with the audience. So I'm not quite known to start a presentation by asking one or two questions. I think it gives me a sense of assurance that there are human beings in the audience. It gives me something to respond to. And the second thing I do is build a lot of eye contact with the people in the audience so it doesn't become just a solid mass. And that's just one example of how I've overcome imposter syndrome. So just to recap, it's about really thinking calmly, quietly to yourself, what are the points that I want to convey? Understanding that it's not about the volume, but it's about how much, what are the important points? How do I convey those important points? And then thirdly, finding your own individual style in order to find mechanisms to be able to calm yourself. And a second example, I think I spoke to you on the preparation for this was the first time I sat in front of my team. I remember distinctly sitting in front of my team thinking, they're expecting me to lead them. And there was this sort of sense of like, oh my gosh. Again, I was almost one eye on the door thinking, maybe I could just sort of run for the door. I mean, and then, slowly but surely, and this is an evolution. It's not going to happen overnight. I think all of us sort of hope for a magic wand and, suddenly it's going to go away. It's not. I mean, it's like absolutely anything in life. You've got to keep with it. You have to hustle 1% every day and put yourself out of your comfort zone in order to practice those skills. It would have been so easy for me to have said, I have fear of public speaking, therefore I will avoid any roles that involve public speaking. But I wanted to lead. I knew that I could do it, and I wanted to do that so much that became more important, and therefore I knew I had to get through it by practicing. So any opportunity that came up, I said, I'll raise my hand, I'll give the presentation. And slowly and very quickly after a while, it's almost like a snowball. Things improve. The more team members you lead, the more you feel you're equipped to lead. The more you stand on stage, the more you feel comfortable with standing on stage. So I think my advice to everybody would be, get out of your comfort zone, practice. Don't expect yourself to be perfect on day one, not even on day 100. But I can tell you 10, 20 years in, it's a walk in the park for me now to do these things, to lead large teams, to lead transition, to stand on stage. I feel extremely comfortable with it. And instead of looking for the door out, I can't wait to get in the door and stand on stage and do those.
That's fantastic, Liz. Thanks for sharing. And talking a little bit about co-parenting, and obviously both parents have got a significant role to play in the rearing of children, and the workplace is changing and being more accommodative of those types of scenarios now. It's undergone tremendous changes over the past years, with companies offering parental leave to both parents, and both parents also taking greater responsibility in childcare. I think the pandemic saw a huge increase in both parents' ability to, for instance, collect children at the end of the school day. And there are legislative changes and frameworks that permit, if you like, parents to be more present and involved in bringing up children and building those important bonds with them. What do you think are the impacts of those changes?
I think this goes back to my original answer to your first question. I mean, the bond of a father to a child is so important, to be able to almost narrate and speak both gendered languages, to understand how the father works, the mother works, to build a bond with both your mother and your father, I think is, intangibly important. And I've experienced the benefits of exactly that. As I said, really the first, 10 years, my mother and my father, and then the subsequent, good 7, 8 years, a very, very strong father-daughter bond. And that's stood me in huge good stead for the rest of my life. I think it's great what's happening. the fact that there's more paternal leave, that it's also societally more, accepted, is a huge step forward for both men and women, men who want to take that, and I think for women who want to return to the workplace. And I think each individual couple, it might be male, female, 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 male, male, needs to find its own rhythm. And that might also look different. I think there's also cases where I know friends whose mothers have helped, whose mother-in-law has helped, or the father-in-law or the father. I think whatever effectively works for you. In my case, as I mentioned, it was the third person was the maid, a nanny to the children, which was also fantastic. I think whatever is something that you need to make your ideal life model work is exactly what you should be thinking about way before you decide on starting a family. I think the most critical decision you'll ever make is the choice of a life partner, because it can make or break so much in your life, your professional decisions, your ability to do the things. For example, I talked about I love having my hobbies. I talked about loving, waking up at 5 a.m., having that time to myself. All of that would not be feasible were I not to have a life partner in my life who is fully prepared to share the not the burden, but the responsibilities, and the various tasks that we have. And those are manifest. We have, we're now living in Germany. We have things like the washing, the cleaning, the cooking, all of those things that constitute a family life. With 2 children, we have a dog, and it's something I think needs talking about very openly, in the sense of who realistically will be doing X, who will be doing Y, who will be picking up the children, who will be attending the parents' evenings. I think it's extremely important that these things are not swept under the carpet or sort of thought, okay, we'll talk about that when it happens. It's too late. I think it's a very important discussion to have, and the more open the communication is, the better things will work through and work out. I started a women's network with 2 other fantastic women at this company, and we had about 1,500 women in this women's network. And I'd say the majority of the people I spoke to when I asked about the challenges they're facing were exactly this topic, how to manage the home life and ensure a good balance. And that's why I've come to the conclusion that the choice we make in a partner, and the choice we make in setting up our infrastructure at home is perhaps the most critical choice for a woman who would like to balance both work life and home life and derive joy from both.
Thanks. And I think you're right. It probably goes back to what your mother instilled in you as well, right? Of knowing your value and connecting that kind of early experience together with the decisions that you make later in life. So Liz, you've moved and relocated several
Yeah.
times. Perhaps you could share for the benefit of our listeners how you dealt with all of the changes that come about with relocating and how really moving brought or changed your views along the way.
Yes, absolutely. So I first relocated when I was 18 within the UK. And at the age of 19, I relocated from the UK to Germany. When I was 32, actually, when I was 31, I took a year off from this company and traveled around the world for a year by myself. Then I relocated after that to Taiwan when I was 32. Subsequently, I relocated to Hong Kong, and thereafter I relocated to Singapore. And I've also spent a number of months living in India, in Bangalore. So I would claim to know a fair bit about relocation and the trials and tribulations it brings with it. Looking back on all of those decisions, every single one of them, I think, was an incredible decision. I also relocated within Germany 5 times to various cities for different roles. It was tough at times. The loneliness I think I felt in Taiwan, and I also relocated from Munich to Leverkusen at the beginning, was absolutely real. That sense of not knowing anybody, the long weekend that stretched ahead of me on a Friday when I said goodbye to the colleagues at work, arriving in Taiwan and being the only person who really only spoke English. I was the only non-Taiwanese colleague in the office at the time. There was no social media when I was there. It was extremely lonely, and extremely important for me, because I think when you have tough times like that, it builds so much more empathy and sympathy for people in a similar situation. So, having traveled extensively by myself, If I see a solo female traveler, I will go straight up to that person and make an effort to connect with them. If we have, and we do have a lot of colleagues relocating to this office from various places in the world by themselves, I'm the person who extends, an invitation to come and spend some time with me and my family at the weekend. I'm very cognizant and acutely aware of how that feels because I've been through that myself. So I think that builds a sense of awareness, which is very important. Second is cultural identification and cultural understanding. I think with all of those experiences, and I told you I traveled extensively, it's almost, I see myself as an adapter plug. I feel the more I'm able to connect into other cultures, the more versatile I become, and the better I become as a leader and as a human being. I think the sense of understanding each other is of such critical importance, perhaps now more than ever before, and that stands me in good stead in so many different ways. My advice would be get through the loneliness, know that it's going to be a question of time before ultimately that will pass. Um, a sense of freedom. I mean, there is something absolutely wonderful about being off the grid. I remember being in Bolivia in a bus, driving from one place to the middle of the desert, thinking, nobody knows where I am right now. I can really be any version of myself I want to be. And you can discover yourself if you're in a new environment. You can rediscover yourself. You can almost set a new identity for yourself. And it's very liberating. Listen to, and I mean, listen with your eyes and your ears. I think the only way you're going to truly understand a culture is by observing in very great detail how that culture operates. And if you're arriving somewhere new, you're going to have a lot of time on your hands. Use that time wisely rather than spending the time indoors, sort of feeling sorry for yourself. When I was in Taiwan, I walked the streets almost endlessly. I just watched, I observed, I took photos, I tried to build conversations with people. I read as much as I could. When I relocated to Germany from the UK, I thought the first thing I need to do is really get my arms around this language to the extent that I could be native. And I think if you understand a language, it's almost a key to unlocking a culture. And for me, that was extremely important. So I think culture is important to understand it, getting past the initial loneliness, being brave in reaching out. I mean, I did some crazy things. Yeah, I mean, it got crazy and crazy. At the beginning, I wrote a list. It's almost a German version of myself. I wrote a list in Chile, I'm going to see this temple, this church, whatever. And by the end of this year, I bought myself a horse in Mongolia, and I was riding with this horse across the Gobi Desert. Then I sold the horse, went to live with a family in Siberia, and spent some time by Lake Baikal. I mean, you just become so much more confident and self-assured with every moment that you choose to leave your comfort zone and reach out to understand and build your knowledge. So all in all, an absolute advocate for living abroad, moving abroad. And I think that this probably won't be my last station also here in Munich in my life.
That's incredible. And roll on to country number 100, which I think is probably right around the corner. So, Liz, you've given us lots of tips and insights, which are all marvelous. Before I let you go, we do ask our guests to share one top tip. So, what would you have for our listeners?
My top tip would be actively work towards doing something that genuinely scares you as often as you possibly can. And that could be, for example, last Sunday, 2 days ago, I was taking a dance class in a new dance I've never danced before. And there's leaders and followers in all of the dances, and there were not sufficient numbers of leaders. And therefore I'd signed up as a follower. And to become a leader in a new dance is quite a difficult thing to do. And after the first hour, I thought, I'm going to switch. I'm going to become a leader for this dance and dance for the next 5 hours as a leader in a dance I've never danced before. And I felt, the first 10 minutes, you suddenly start thinking, well, I'm really proud of myself for doing this. And by the end of the day, I just thought I've learned so much more by doing just a small thing that scared me. For the first hour, I thought, no, I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it. And by second hour, I was like, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to put my hand up. I'm going to switch sides and I'm going to do something actively that I feel is a stretch for me where I'm leaving my comfort zone. And there are many examples of things that I've done. my feeling is every single time you face your fear and you get past the fear, you grow as a person. And we're all talking about things like the growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. You can only grow if you feel you're being stretched, and you're getting out of a comfortable environment and facing a fear. And that could be so many different things. And it's not that big things like jumping out of an airplane, which I've also done because I had that as a fear. I thought, I'm not going to let that stop me. I'm going to jump out of the airplane. And when the door finally came up, I thought, I'm going to jump first because otherwise I'm definitely never going to jump. And I think it's really about just thinking about what can I do actively to get out of my comfort zone, to build the person I am, to become a better version of myself every single day.
That's great. Be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Thanks, Liz. It was such a pleasure to have you on our show today.
Absolutely.
Once again, thank you for listening to Sirva Soundbites. If you enjoy our show, click subscribe and share, and be sure to come back next time. If you've got any questions or comments, feel free to drop us a note at soundbites@sirva.com. Until then, this is Kate and Liz. And don't forget, Sirva provides everything needed to move talent and deliver the ultimate employee experience. See you next time.